The Barrett estate loomed at the edge of town like a sentinel of old secrets, its weathered stone walls and ivy-choked windows concealing a reputation that had remained unchallenged for generations. To the townsfolk, the Barrett bloodline was untouchable, pristine, a symbol of unblemished wealth and power, its members moving through life with an almost ethereal grace, untouched by scandal or misfortune. Yet beneath the polished veneer, whispers lingered, stray murmurs of children vanishing for nights on end, of rooms that no outsider dared enter, of a darkness that the family carried like a shadow that would not release them. For decades, the town held its collective breath, content to admire the Barretts from afar, until a single piece of paper emerged from the dust of forgotten archives, a birth record dated 1986. At first, it seemed innocuous, almost bureaucratic in its formality, yet the information it contained sent tremors through the foundation of the family's carefully constructed myth. Names, dates, and connections that had never been spoken aloud now lay bare on the page, challenging the long-held belief in the Barretts' untarnished purity. No one remembered who had placed it there, nor why it had gone unnoticed for so long. But the moment it surfaced, the town's uneasy fascination with the Barrett estate took on a new edge. Eyes that had once admired now watched with suspicion, whispers that had been polite hints of unease transformed into questions too dangerous to ignore. Somewhere in the shadows of the old estate, the family's secrets stirred, restless, waiting for the reckoning that had finally arrived. The Barrett family had long been the undisputed emblem of prestige and refinement in their small town, a lineage whose name alone carried weight in every conversation, every decision, every whispered judgment among neighbors. Their estate, perched on a hill like a crown over the valley below, had been meticulously maintained for generations, its sprawling gardens, ornate gates, and towering stone walls a testament to the wealth and influence the family wielded. To outsiders, the Barretts embodied an almost mythic standard of virtue, sophistication, and propriety, a family seemingly untouched by scandal, crime, or the petty failures that plagued ordinary lives. This reputation for purity was not limited to their social conduct but extended to the very blood running through their veins. Stories were told of ancestors who had married only within carefully selected circles, maintaining a lineage so unbroken and controlled that it became a point of pride, a symbol of moral and genetic superiority. Townspeople spoke of them with a mixture of reverence and fear, treating every action, every gathering, and every public appearance as a performance that confirmed the Barretts' untouchable status. Even the children, from a young age, were expected to walk, speak, and behave in ways that reflected the family's meticulous standards, their education and manners carefully monitored to ensure no deviation from the accepted image. Beneath this veneer, however, was a quiet insistence on secrecy and control. The Barretts discouraged curiosity about the estate's inner workings and discouraged friendships outside their own sanctioned circles. Outsiders were welcomed only superficially, often treated to lavish displays of wealth and refinement that masked the undercurrents of rigid expectations and unspoken rules. In public, they were flawless. In private, their lives were regimented, their interactions carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances. Every photograph, every public announcement, every community event became a tool to reinforce the narrative of purity, and any hint of scandal or imperfection was swiftly suppressed or redirected. Their reputation was so carefully curated that even longtime residents began to believe in the myth of the pure Barrett bloodline, perpetuating the belief that this family was somehow separate from the messiness of ordinary life, above the reach of misfortune, and protected by a tradition so disciplined it seemed almost sacred. It was a reputation that, once established, became almost impossible to question, giving the Barretts an aura of untouchability, one that would later make the emergence of the 1986 birth record all the more shocking and destabilizing, revealing that the very foundations of their celebrated lineage were far more fragile than anyone had ever suspected. Despite the Barrett family's carefully cultivated image of perfection, there were always whispers, small and fleeting at first, that suggested the estate and its occupants were not as untouchable as the town had long believed. These murmurs often emerged in quiet corners of the local market, at the edge of church gatherings, or in the soft conversations of children too young to fully understand the weight of what they were repeating. Neighbors spoke cautiously of strange sounds drifting from the estate at night, of lights flickering in rooms that were supposedly unused, and of figures glimpsed moving behind curtained windows when no one was expected. Some claimed to have seen children who belonged to the Barretts wandering the grounds in the dead of night, their eyes hollow, their movements unnatural, and yet no one dared ask questions openly, because the family's reputation carried a silent threat that extended far beyond gossip. The town had long learned that curiosity about the Barretts came at a cost, that prying too deeply invited scrutiny, suspicion, and sometimes subtle retaliation. The local law enforcement, comprised mostly of lifelong residents who had grown up revering the family, rarely intervened in the estate's affairs, and any incidents that occurred within the property were quietly filed away, unremarkable on official records, as if the walls themselves absorbed transgressions without leaving evidence. Among the servants and caretakers who worked within the estate, there were accounts of locked doors leading to parts of the house never meant to be entered, hallways that seemed to twist and stretch in ways that defied normal architecture, and whispers of rituals conducted behind closed doors, events that made even the most loyal employees uneasy. Some recalled nights when screams or hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors, only to vanish by morning as though the house had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace. Even the most casual visitors to the Barrett estate reported a feeling of being watched, a weight in the air that made the skin crawl and the heart race without explanation. The more time people spent near the estate, the more stories accumulated, each one adding to a tapestry of unease, of suppressed fear, and of the sense that the family harbored secrets far darker than the public could imagine. These rumors, while never fully substantiated, had a power of their own, infiltrating the minds of townsfolk and shaping the way they interacted with the Barretts, mixing admiration with an undercurrent of dread, creating an atmosphere where even a simple glance at the family's windows could conjure questions better left unasked and suspicions best kept hidden. The hushed speculation formed a delicate tension, a prelude to the revelations that would one day emerge, proving that the family's pristine image had always been maintained on a foundation as fragile as it was deceptive. The emergence of the 1986 birth record was the first tangible crack in the Barrett family's carefully maintained facade, a single sheet of paper that carried with it the weight to unravel decades of cultivated perfection. For years, the town had accepted the narrative of the Barretts as a family without blemish, untouchable and untarnished, their lineage celebrated in whispers and admiration alike. Yet the record, discovered in a long-forgotten drawer in the town registry office, introduced an element that the family could neither control nor erase. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, the standard details of name, date of birth, parentage, and registration information. But upon closer inspection, the details began to challenge everything the town believed about the family's lineage. Names that had never been publicly linked to the Barretts were listed in the parentage section, suggesting a connection that defied the family's narrative of purity. The document, typed and stamped with official authority, carried an undeniable legitimacy that rumors and whispered doubts had never managed to achieve. For those who stumbled upon it, the discovery was unsettling, almost surreal, as if a phantom from the past had suddenly been given flesh and form. The bureaucratic tone of the record belied the storm it would ignite, presenting the information in the most neutral, factual terms while simultaneously hinting at a scandal too large to ignore. It was not merely a question of a birth occurring in secrecy but of the implications that rippled through generations, the possibility that the family's celebrated bloodline might have been compromised, that the very foundation of their social dominance was built on selective truths and hidden transgressions. As word of the record began to circulate quietly among a few curious town officials and archivists, unease grew in the streets. People who had once viewed the Barretts with awe now exchanged furtive glances and cautious words, realizing that the immaculate image of the family might be a carefully constructed illusion. For the Barretts themselves, the record was both a threat and a puzzle, a relic from the past that demanded explanation or concealment. The family's influence and meticulous control over their public perception had previously been enough to suppress any hint of scandal, but this document existed outside their reach, immune to charm, wealth, or intimidation. It was a subtle yet powerful reminder that even the most carefully guarded secrets could emerge when least expected, capable of dismantling reputations, sowing doubt, and awakening a long-suppressed curiosity about the true nature of the Barretts and the history they had labored so long to conceal. This single record, innocuous in appearance but explosive in meaning, marked the beginning of a reckoning that the town and the family alike would never forget. The first person to speak openly about the strange events within the Barrett estate was a caretaker who had served the family for decades, Someone whose loyalty had long shielded the town from the truth but whose conscience could no longer remain silent. Her voice trembled as she recounted memories she had buried deep in her mind, fragments of nights spent in dimly lit hallways and afternoons shadowed by a sense of unease she could never fully name. She remembered the endless corridors lined with heavy, dark wood, doors that appeared ordinary but hid rooms that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Sometimes she would hear the sound of whispers drifting from behind these doors, voices too low to understand yet sharp enough to make the hair on her neck stand on end. The air itself in certain parts of the estate seemed heavier, almost suffocating, as if it remembered all the secrets the family had pressed into its walls over the years. She spoke of children who would vanish from sight for hours, sometimes days, only to reappear with vacant expressions, their eyes reflecting a fear that they could not articulate. These disappearances were never questioned aloud, never investigated, as if the estate itself had the power to discourage curiosity, bending reality to protect the family's image. There were nights when she was forced to witness the Barretts performing rituals in candlelit rooms, ceremonies she could not comprehend, their meaning hidden behind layers of tradition and silence. The more she observed, the more she realized that the family's obsession with purity and control was not merely symbolic. It was enforced with meticulous care and, in some cases, with intimidation so subtle it left no evidence. Even the servants, she recalled, were compelled to obey without hesitation, their compliance maintained through a mixture of fear, loyalty, and dependence on the estate for livelihood. Over the years, the caretaker had internalized a sense of inevitability, a belief that the estate itself demanded obedience and secrecy, punishing those who strayed too far with whispers of consequences that never needed to be articulated. Yet the 1986 birth record had changed everything, stirring memories she had long tried to suppress and compelling her to finally speak. As she shared her recollections, details that had once been dismissed as imagination or misinterpretation gained credibility, forming a mosaic of subtle horrors that no one could ignore. Her testimony, painstakingly precise yet haunted by emotion, began to pierce the illusion of perfection the Barretts had so carefully constructed, revealing that behind the facade of refinement and social prestige lay a network of control, fear, and unspoken violations that had remained hidden for decades, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be contained. In the dusty attic of the Barrett estate, long sealed from prying eyes, a diary was discovered, its leather cover cracked and worn, pages yellowed with age but preserved enough to speak across decades. The diary had belonged to a member of the family whose identity had long been obscured, a voice hidden in plain sight, recording events and thoughts that no one outside the estate was meant to know. From the very first entries, it became clear that the family's obsession with purity was far more than a social ideal. It was an all-consuming doctrine that dictated every action, every relationship, every breath taken within those walls. The words, at first cryptic and scattered, gradually revealed patterns of secrecy, control, and a rigid hierarchy that placed the reputation of the lineage above human decency. Names were carefully coded, relationships obscured through invented symbols and shorthand, yet the meaning could still be deciphered by someone patient enough to read between the lines. The diary described rooms locked for decades, corridors that twisted with an almost intentional disorientation, and the presence of children whose existence seemed both central and forbidden at the same time. Entries spoke of punishments inflicted for minor transgressions, of lessons in obedience that bordered on ritualized terror, and of the way the family monitored even the smallest gestures to ensure nothing sullied their immaculate image. Some pages hinted at the existence of individuals who were kept hidden, their lives and identities erased from public knowledge, yet carefully recorded here, suggesting a parallel reality within the estate itself, one that no outsider could perceive. The diary also contained confessions, brief, sometimes desperate statements that betrayed fear, guilt, and the heavy weight of enforced silence. There were moments when the author's own uncertainty surfaced, small cracks of doubt about the morality of the family's actions, though they were quickly overshadowed by loyalty or fear of reprisal. The meticulousness with which the entries were kept reflected the same obsessive control that governed the estate's daily life, as though documenting each act, each thought, was a way to preserve the family's twisted version of truth. Over time, patterns emerged that suggested the diary was not merely a personal account but a record meant to survive as a testament, a hidden archive that could one day reveal what had been concealed. With the diary in hand, anyone reading it could trace the origins of the Barrett's obsession, the mechanisms by which they maintained authority, and the chilling reality of how the family's public image of perfection had been constructed at the expense of privacy, morality, and human decency, hinting at the deeper secrets that would soon be illuminated by the revelations surrounding the 1986 birth record. The child named in the 1986 birth record returned to the town years later, grown, unaware of the full magnitude of the legacy into which they had been born. Unlike the rest of the Barretts, whose lives had been meticulously scripted to maintain an image of perfection, this individual carried with them a natural curiosity and an innocence that made them both vulnerable and unknowingly disruptive. Their presence in the town immediately stirred unease among longtime residents, who had come to accept the Barretts as untouchable figures, almost mythical in their perceived moral and social superiority. The child's return was subtle at first: a quiet appearance at a public market, a tentative inquiry about the estate, a chance encounter with someone who had once worked within its walls, but these small acts rippled outward, drawing attention from those who remembered the hushed whispers and rumors surrounding the family. As they walked the familiar streets, there was a palpable tension in the air, as if the town itself recognized the significance of their return. The grown child, however, was oblivious to the undercurrents, experiencing the town's stares and cautious greetings as curious but largely innocuous, unaware that each encounter carried the weight of decades of secrets. Within the Barrett estate, the reaction was far more charged. The family, accustomed to controlling every narrative and every public perception, found themselves confronted with a variable they could neither anticipate nor suppress. Meetings were held in secret, decisions weighed in hushed tones, and family members cast furtive glances at one another, realizing that the carefully constructed image of purity was now threatened by someone who had emerged outside their control. The child's very existence represented a contradiction, a living testament to the fragility of the myth they had nurtured. As days passed, the grown child began to sense the unspoken tension, the glances that lingered too long, the subtle changes in conversation when they were present, and the peculiar absence of certain relatives from gatherings. Each of these clues hinted at an invisible barrier they were not meant to cross, a silent warning that the estate's history was not as straightforward as it seemed. Driven by instinct rather than knowledge, they began to ask questions, seeking understanding of the family they had never truly known, and unwittingly initiating a process of revelation that the Barretts had spent generations suppressing. Their curiosity, innocent yet relentless, set in motion a series of events that would expose cracks in the family's pristine image, unravel carefully maintained deceptions, and force confrontations that had long been avoided. The return of this individual acted as both catalyst and mirror, reflecting the hidden truths of the Barrett lineage and signaling the beginning of a reckoning that the family had neither anticipated nor prepared to face. The fragile illusion surrounding the Barrett family began to crumble when a historian, drawn to the town by the family's long-standing reputation and whispers of hidden histories, started to dig deeper into the records and stories that had been carefully buried or ignored. Unlike the casual curiosity of townsfolk, this investigator possessed a relentless drive to uncover truth, guided by a methodical patience and an instinct for connecting dots that others had failed or feared to see. At first, the research appeared straightforward: archival searches, interviews with longtime residents, and examination of public records. But as the historian probed further, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge: gaps in family records, anomalies in reported births, and unexplained absences of certain individuals that contradicted the narrative of flawless lineage. Each discovery, carefully noted and cross-referenced, painted a picture that was at odds with the town's cherished belief in the Barretts' perfection. The historian's inquiries did not go unnoticed. Townspeople, who had long maintained a delicate balance between respect, fear, and curiosity, began to react with unease, some quietly warning the investigator to tread carefully, while others, emboldened by the arrival of someone willing to challenge the family's untouchable image, offered hints and half-told stories that had been suppressed for decades. The more the historian uncovered, the clearer it became that the Barretts had orchestrated an elaborate system of control, manipulating not only public perception but the very mechanisms of record-keeping, social interactions, and family memory. Photographs were staged, official documents carefully curated, and personal histories rewritten or erased to maintain the illusion of purity. The discovery of the 1986 birth record became a crucial piece of evidence, a keystone that allowed the historian to connect hidden threads of the family's story. Conversations with former caretakers, previously dismissed as the ramblings of loyal servants, now gained credibility, providing context to the coded language found in diaries and private journals. As the investigation deepened, pressure mounted within the Barrett estate. Family members, long accustomed to controlling every narrative, realized that their version of reality was under siege, and that the historian's work could not be stopped through charm, intimidation, or wealth alone. Interviews became tense, access to private spaces restricted, and the subtle networks of influence that had once silenced inquisitive voices began to fray. The historian, aware of the stakes but undeterred, continued to piece together the fragments of truth, understanding that the town's perception of the Barretts, built over generations of fear and admiration, was teetering on the edge of collapse. Each revelation brought the family closer to exposure, forcing long-buried secrets to the surface and signaling that the pristine image of the Barrett bloodline was far more fragile than anyone had dared imagine, setting the stage for confrontations and reckonings that had long been inevitable. The Barrett estate, long considered a symbol of elegance and refinement, began to reveal its true nature as investigators and curious townsfolk probed deeper into its walls, uncovering secrets that had been carefully concealed for generations. Hidden rooms, previously thought to be mere storage spaces, were found to be meticulously arranged with artifacts, documents, and photographs that painted a far darker portrait of the family than anyone had imagined. Basements sealed for decades held remnants of past events, objects placed with deliberate intent, and traces of activities that suggested an obsession with control, secrecy, and the enforcement of the family's rigid ideals. Photographs, once displayed only in curated galleries and social announcements, were discovered in hidden albums that showed expressions, gestures, and situations that contradicted the public image of grace and decorum. These images, coupled with letters and personal notes, hinted at relationships and actions that had been deliberately erased from official histories. Each revelation added layers to a story that the Barretts had worked tirelessly to suppress, suggesting that the family's obsession with purity was not merely symbolic but an active, almost ritualistic force that shaped the lives of every member. Certain hallways, long avoided by servants and visitors, were revealed to contain signs of surveillance, not just of property but of the inhabitants themselves, ensuring that behaviors aligned with the family's strict standards. The architecture of the estate itself seemed to have been designed to enforce obedience and secrecy, with hidden passages, false doors, and rooms that could be locked and concealed at will, creating a labyrinth in which control was absolute. These discoveries gave context to the whispers that had long circulated in the town, stories of disappearances, unexplained noises, and strange occurrences that were dismissed as imagination or rumor but now took on a chilling plausibility. The very walls of the estate seemed to bear witness to the accumulation of decades of manipulation, fear, and unspoken violence, their surfaces holding the memory of the family's relentless pursuit of perfection at the expense of human dignity. As more evidence came to light, the scale of the deception became increasingly impossible to ignore. It was no longer a question of personal quirks or isolated incidents but a systemic pattern of control and secrecy, orchestrated to protect the Barrett's image at all costs. Each hidden document, photograph, and architectural peculiarity served as a reminder that the family's history was a carefully curated illusion, one that had been maintained with precision and ruthlessness. These discoveries forced the town, the historian, and even the Barretts themselves to confront the unsettling reality that the family's obsession with purity had not only dictated public perception but had shaped the very structure of their lives, creating an estate that was both a fortress and a cage. The tension surrounding the Barrett family reached a breaking point as the accumulation of evidence, testimonies, and uncovered documents forced a confrontation between the family and the town, a reckoning that had long been inevitable. The historian's work, coupled with the accounts of former caretakers and the revelations embedded in hidden diaries, made it impossible for the Barretts to continue their performance of unblemished perfection. As townsfolk became aware of the growing body of proof, fear and admiration mingled with outrage, creating a charged atmosphere in which every glance, every conversation, and every visit to the estate became fraught with significance. Meetings, once private and confidential, became arenas for negotiation and argument, with family members attempting to control the narrative while others pressed for acknowledgement of the truth. The grown child from the 1986 birth record, whose existence had already destabilized the carefully curated image of the family, became a focal point, both a symbol of the fragility of the Barretts' public persona and a living reminder of the secrets that had been buried for decades. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors now spilled into public spaces, town squares, and council meetings, where neighbors, officials, and longtime residents confronted the family with questions they could no longer avoid. The Barretts, accustomed to controlling perception through wealth, influence, and intimidation, found themselves increasingly isolated, their authority challenged not just by facts but by the moral and emotional weight of generations of deception. Disputes erupted over the legitimacy of past marriages, the nature of relationships that had been hidden, and the implications of a lineage that had been declared pure yet was now undeniably compromised. Family members turned on one another, old alliances strained, and secrets long thought secure were laid bare in arguments that mixed accusation, denial, and desperation. At the same time, the town itself wrestled with its own complicity, realizing that years of fear and reverence had allowed the Barretts to operate unchecked, that silence had been mistaken for respect, and that curiosity had been stifled by an invisible, coercive force. The confrontation did not resolve neatly. It was messy, emotional, and fraught with ambiguity, reflecting the complexity of the human relationships entangled in the family's history. Through it all, the estate, the symbols of wealth and control, and the hidden documents acted as both evidence and witness, reinforcing the gravity of the revelations and the impossibility of returning to the previous state of unquestioned admiration. The clash between descendants, townspeople, and the truths they were forced to face illuminated the full scope of the Barretts' deception, revealing a family that had long relied on secrecy and fear to maintain its image, and showing that once hidden histories are unearthed, even the most powerful reputations are vulnerable to collapse under the weight of their own buried sins. The legacy of the Barrett family, once believed to be untouchable and unassailable, became a subject of deep uncertainty as the revelations surrounding the 1986 birth record and the subsequent uncovering of hidden truths shook the foundations of everything the town had accepted for decades. The notion of purity that had defined the family's public image was exposed as fragile, contingent, and meticulously constructed, leaving townsfolk and family members alike to grapple with questions that could no longer be ignored. The family's influence, once unchallenged, now seemed insufficient to contain the fallout, as whispers transformed into conversations, and conversations escalated into confrontations that forced everyone to confront the human consequences of generations of secrecy. Descendants of the Barretts found themselves caught between loyalty to a family name and the undeniable reality of the deception that had governed their lives, their positions, privileges, and even personal identities now reframed through the lens of truth. The townspeople, too, struggled to reconcile their long-standing admiration with the mounting evidence of manipulation, control, and concealment, their own complicity in sustaining the family's image weighing heavily on the collective conscience. The grown child from the 1986 record, central to the unraveling of the Barrett myth, became both a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the consequences of hidden transgressions, prompting reflection on the human cost of the obsession with lineage, appearances, and social standing. Legal and social questions arose as historians, journalists, and local authorities debated the implications of the discoveries, including the morality of past actions, the legitimacy of recorded histories, and the responsibilities of the present generation in addressing the past. For some within the family, the realization that the myth of purity had been shattered was liberating, an opportunity to redefine themselves and confront long-suppressed truths, while for others it was devastating, an existential threat to identities built upon the careful orchestration of perception. The estate itself, once a monument to elegance and control, became a symbol of the tension between appearance and reality, its hidden rooms and secret records now visible as reminders that power built on concealment is inherently unstable. Ultimately, the question of the Barrett legacy remained unresolved, suspended in a liminal space between past and present, myth and reality, pride and shame. The town, the descendants, and even outsiders who had observed the events unfold were left to reckon with the ambiguity of history, understanding that while certain truths could be uncovered and acknowledged, the emotional and social consequences would ripple through generations, shaping relationships, perceptions, and narratives in ways that could never be fully contained. The story of the Barrett family thus became not only a tale of revelation and scandal but also a meditation on the precariousness of legacy, the dangers of idealization, and the inescapable weight of truth when it finally emerges to challenge the stories we tell ourselves and the images we strive so hard to protect.